how can mind be an obstacle if mind in itself is the instrumentality of consciousness? Mind doesn't have agency of its own. To say that something can cover consciousness, it always has the underlying relativity behind that saying, because it is only relevant on a level where the duality prevalent experience. Essentially speaking, nothing can prevent consciousness from knowing itself directly. Absolutely nothing. No ego, no mind, no maya, no coverings, because all these notions, all these realities, even if we call them realities, permitted by consciousness, and they have light of their own only because that light is being illumined by consciousness itself. So, on the other hand, the mind stands accused. It is true, the mind is something which does not allow us to experience our self in its full measure. Let's look at it from the point of view of what mind is and what it is not. For instance, in Vedic tradition, the word consciousness and the word mind both denotes by the same term, chit. Chit is supreme consciousness and chit is individual mind. It all depends when and how that word is used, denotes what the speaker or the author means when using that word. But essentially, mind is of the same nature. It's not different from consciousness. Numerous examples have been given to kind of illustrate this whole phenomena. With the surface of the ocean, when the ocean is rippled, when there are many waves, that's when the mind is. Soon as the ripples and all the waves subside and the surface of the ocean is still, it's no longer mind, it's consciousness. So it's a little bit like that. So mind acts as a kind of lens which allows consciousness to have experience of individual nature. In other words, it gives that kind of possibility for any experience to take place on individual level of existence. But it's not different from the light of consciousness itself. So how can we accuse mind? How can we accuse something which is an instrumentality and not an entity in itself? Okay, it's a matter of speech. Kill the mind, drop the mind, you could hear that all the time. However, how can you drop something which is essentially identity of your own? Because you cannot just jump out of your mind. You cannot just take off the mind as you take off your clothes before you go to bed. It happens naturally, and that's the whole secret. There's no secret. It just happens by itself. When you transcend, the mind starts to contemplate itself by itself alone. And there comes a time in meditation when the mind transcends itself to a degree when it becomes no mind. And that's all there is to it. It's not that mind is dead, it's not that mind is gone somewhere, it's just mind becomes consciousness, what it was always and has always been. Nothing changes in the mind. What changes is the quality of vibration. So one could say that mind in its active state is a much grosser vibration than mind at the level when it's become no longer. It's no longer flickering. There is no longer any movement of thought. That's an infinitely finer vibration than mind on the level of thinking, on the level of ideation, on the level of rippling. For that reason, the first sutra of the Patanjali Yoga Sutras states Chitta Vritti Nirodha, which means cessation of the fluctuation of the mind is freedom. Cessation of the fluctuation of the mind is yoga. It's basically a statement which opens up the whole philosophy of yoga. From there on, the teaching unfolds. But what happens is that cessation of the fluctuations of the mind. Mind is not dead. It hasn't gone anywhere. It's just the fluctuations have been subsided to the degree where the unity takes place, where the unity prevails over the state of excitement, over the state of vibration on the relative level. So we can assume, we can conclude that mind in itself is not a problem at all. In fact, if we turn the whole thing around and talk about the experience of self-realization, experience of awakening, experience of enlightenment, if not for the mind, we will have no clue of what has taken place. If not for the mind, we'll have no recollection of the actual event. We will have no something which we can call a reference point, a referential field, because there will be nothing to witness that experience with on the individual level. Because when mind becomes still, when the surface of the ocean totally subsides, it becomes the ocean itself. But how do we know it when we go back, let's say, to the ordinary state of consciousness, when we go back to the waking state of consciousness? We know it through the faculty of mind. And that's a magical moment because mind then knows itself from that moment on. Mind knows its essential nature. And it's worth mentioning that according to the yogic, tantric, Vedic philosophy, which has been formulated, let's say, in the doctrines such as Samkhya philosophy. You can find traces of it in the Kashmir Shaiva tradition, in relevance to the three primordial energies that govern all matter. They are Sattva, balance, equilibrium; Rajas, energy, motion, desire; and Tamas, which is stability, structure, solidity, and inertia. All these gunas of nature constantly rotate. Because of their rotation, the possibility of experience takes place, and the possibility of this whole matrix being experienced as reality. This is where the Maya sets in motion. But in relation to our human physiology, in relation to our human setup, mind stands for Sattva. Senses are governed by Rajas, and physiology itself, the physical structure, is all mind needs is to withdraw from the senses. And as it withdrew from the senses, it then flips back and starts to contemplate its own nature. As it contemplates its own nature, it transcends all these layers, which is made of thoughts, vibrations, and dives to the point where it touches the ground of creation. It touches its own surface of existence. It touches its own depth of being. And that's where consciousness shines forth through in its full glory. So mind is actually a greatest gift. It's not something to be, it's not something to discard or despise. Maybe some teachers prefer to give that kind of shocking statement, something to make an impression on an aspirant that, because of the mind you've been wandering in the wheel of samsara, what have you, because of the mind you have constant thoughts, but the mind itself is not a problem. Mind itself is this beautiful mechanism, it's this beautiful instrumentality of consciousness which allows this experience of reality, this glorious experience on individual level, and at the same time it allows this total expansion beyond of the beyond. And it's all done within the depth of the mind, within the polarities of the mind. That's why Buddhists, they talk about the big mind, which is still the mind, as opposed to the mind of an individual being. There is the cosmic mind, there's the mind of the universe, and they are interconnected, they are one, it's just the different degrees of superimposition that gives the impression of mind being this or being that. So let's not discard the baby with the water. Let's use our mind at its best. Let us realize that the mind only becomes the slave when the mind is enslaved by the senses. And then in turn, our experience becomes imprisonment by all these impressions, by all these thoughts, by all these vibrations that are only on a surface, that constantly brings us out on a surface and keeps us on a surface. So all it needs to be done is to allow the mind to contemplate itself. Thence meditation, thence transcendence, thence yoga is the cessation of the fluctuation of the mind.